It's part 6, page 441, but I want to just step back for a second because we're at a transition. We're going to move on to the Diencephalon, but first let's just remember who was the Telencephalon. The Telencephalon was this portions here of the hemispheres, the cortex, and then we also, besides the gray matter here of the cortex, we also have some gray matter here and here, deeper in the cerebrum, cerebral hemispheres. And instead of calling it the cortex, we call it a nucleus. Okay, so these are basal nuclei. When we're outside of the central nervous system and we have a grouping of cell bodies, we call it something different. We normally call it a ganglion. So historically, there were times when the basal nuclei were called the basal ganglia, and they changed that in order to maintain the nomenclature consistently so that inside the central nervous system, these areas of cell bodies of neurons are referred to as nuclei. Okay, we'll see more of them further along as we go, and sometimes they'll have formal names, and sometimes they'll be called nuclei, like the pontine nuclei, etc. Okay, so we're moving on now to this little purpleness here, which is the diencephalon, and the diencephalon consists of, and I mentioned this at the end of the previous episode, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pituitary. Here we have a little portion of the optic chiasma that interacts with the hypothalamus. We also have the pituitary right there. They're showing us a little bit of choroid plexus of the third ventricle. And the third ventricle is circling around and in between the lobes of the thalamus. And the third ventricle actually goes down here and is enclosed. Some of its lower walls here are enclosed by the hypothalamus. Okay, diencephalon. Sometimes in medical school they would refer to this as the bird brain. Birds are, how shall I say, maintained in their homeostasis by profound capabilities that are sort of built into them. And that's the nature of the diencephalon. The thalamus is a portion of that, and then the hypothalamus is also a portion. Let's sort of get into the thalamus. The thalamus is really the central control and director of, it's a relay. They talk about it as the relay station for information coming into the brain. Okay, so that means sensory. Virtually all sensory. There are examples of sensory, especially smells, that do not actually go first to the thalamus, but virtually everything else throughout the body goes first to the thalamus. So it is a relay station in that regard. And so all of our afferent means moving toward the central nervous system. Afferent impulses, of course, are sensory. So that's part of the deal. There are some reflexes that are a portion of incoming as well. And so sometimes we go up to get information and come back down to operate with that information. Okay, so let's go over here to the next little detail, which is the hypothalamus, named for the position below the thalamus. And we have what I like to call lots of jelly beans involved here. So here we have all of these different areas. Now, it would be a neuroscience course to get into each one of these areas, but suffice it to say that many things are mapped on to each side of the thalamus. See that there are two lobes. Note and remember that there's that tiny little appendage between the two lobes called the intermediate mass. It's an important detail. There's connection between sides. And so the thalamus is receiving information. The information coming from the retina is mapped. It's mapped across the back of the retina, and it's also mapped here on the thalamus. That same mapping and geography is then extended in the next set of neurons, in the next portion of the circuit, to the occipital lobe and its cortex on the back of the brain. And so there again we have a geographical representation of what is the world in front of us. Are you with me on that? So we're maintaining the geography of what we see. We don't quite have that sense of geography with regard to sound. Sometimes we have it with regard to touch because we have that homunculus. So at any rate, everything goes into the thalamus and it gets redistributed through a corona radiata throughout the rest of the brain. Then we have other regulatory jelly beans here, and this is the work of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is sort of the highest level of command when it comes to things like the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. So think of it that way, is that this is the highest level of command. Now, command is not something that, how shall I say, there's the introjection of things. That is to say that I can practice certain prime directives, which then become a part of the command system. Okay, so I can be aware that certain smells, like coming from an open gas pipe, indicates fear or danger, and so there are some things that can get, how shall I say, stimulated here. So let's see what can be stimulated, what's being regulated, and I'm listing here 7 things overall that we can say are being managed by these control centers in the hypothalamus. We begin with the control of the autonomic nervous system, and so that's everything to do with heart rate, breathing rate, digestion. Okay, there's also an aspect of autonomic nervous system in sexual response. There's arousal, and there's climax, and there's recovery. So every aspect of the human body has something that is regulating autonomic nervous system functions within the body, and they give us their sort of ideas here as well. Blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract motility, eye pupil size, and many other visceral functions. Okay, then we have the physical response to emotion. Therein again, you get cut off in traffic. There's a tremendous, how shall I say, pouring into the blood of epinephrine, and you have a sympathetic response. If you happen to be strapped into your car, obviously you cannot exercise that that response very well, and so you have to have some meditative techniques to calm yourself. If you get into a physical situation in the world when you're not strapped into a 3,000-pound object, then you might be able to take a walk around the block or something like that to metabolize those biochemicals in your bloodstream. There's many other things that are involved in the response to emotion. Of course, there's the limbic system, which involves the richness, emotional richness of life. Most of this has not to do necessarily with any sort of evil or terrifying sorts of things, which is to say that you can be exalted in your activities. It's a rare situation, at least for me and most of the people that I know, when they have, how shall I say, sexual pleasure, that it's some sort of anger or some sort of terrifying thing. So fight or flight doesn't always accrue. Anything that is exalting or energizing might be a part of the program here. So there's many things that can fit into that category without necessarily having a negative emotional response. Okay, so then we have a regulation of body temperature. These things are regulated based oftentimes on climate, that people who endure 4 seasons that are quite, how shall I say, rigorous, can be dealing with attunement to cold temperatures, warm temperatures, and adjusting therein. Okay, there's many things that are being regulated in all of this, so we'll get into that when we have that autonomic nervous system experience, and then we'll press on to 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the next episode.